All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our May Fireside Chat. We hold these on the third Wednesday of every month, and we invite you to join NNRG, our partners, and fellow forest stewards to discuss forest management topics, share information and resources relevant to those, and then just connect with others who may face some of the same challenges and opportunities as you all do in stewarding your forests. These are really intended to be casual, so we'll spend about the first 30 minutes with the presentation, and then we leave the last 30 for questions and discussion. So we'd love to hear from you, and not only your questions, but anything you've been working on around this topic that might help others. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those at that second half. So yeah, thanks for joining us to learn more about carbon monitoring. We have NNRG's lead forester, Jaal Mann, and our planning forester, Matthew Schmidt, here to share more on carbon modeling and how to conduct an inventory. So I will turn things over to them.
All right, so let me just share a screen here, and Matthew will get us started.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks Laura for kicking us off. Yeah, we just wanted to talk a little bit about carbon, and then talk about how we can measure carbon in our own forests, some of the paradigms around carbon accounting, and I guess we've got some slides, but at any point you got a question, just raise your hand, and we don't need to lecture here. So let us know in real time if you have questions. But yeah, anyway, I'm the planning forester, kind of somewhat newly hired in the last 6 months at NNRG. I think I know at least one of you, John Malzik. I was out of your property just recently, so glad to see you on here. And yeah, we'll talk about carbon. So, Jaal, you mind going to the agenda or just kind of the outline?
All right.
So kind of depending on how long you've been on these chats or been consuming NNRG's outreach material, we have covered carbon before. Going all the way back to 2014, we have kind of done outreach and worked on this material. So some of this might be repetitive for you guys, but we're going to start with just kind of talking about how forest carbon works. What is the different carbon cycles? What are the different carbon pools? What is sequestration versus storage? And once we have kind of a working idea about that, then we can talk about how we inventory carbon, how we understand how much carbon is in our forests, and how you can do that in your own stand. So let's jump into it, Jaal. Kind of, like I said, people might be familiar with this, but what is the carbon cycle in forests? We have this atmosphere, which is full of carbon, or actually only 0.4% carbon. But this is a massive carbon pool, the atmosphere, right? And we talk all about how many parts per million are in the atmosphere. And from this large pool in the atmosphere, plants pull down carbon in their growth through photosynthesis. They fix carbon into cellulose, lignin, other kind of woody biomass that they use in their growth. And so this is carbon from the atmosphere into living organisms. In forest, we're often talking about trees, shrubs, understory plants, but they're all fixing carbon from the atmosphere. And then carbon is staying in these pools, which are either living or if the tree dies, dead. And then depending on kind of what happens after a tree dies, it begins to decay, and eventually that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. It can either be through respiration of fungal organisms. It can be through forest fire, burning and consuming and releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. But the whole thing is just a cycle from carbon to carbon. The forest rises and falls. And these what's interesting about it is trying to understand the rate of change between these different pools. How quickly do forests grow? Tell us how quickly we can sequester carbon from the atmosphere into living biomass. And managing different decay rates. One part of the cycle I've neglected here is we can intervene in this natural cycle of carbon by harvesting, by doing management activities, and producing wood products, which are their own carbon pool. And those products, though, are, have a finite life. In time, all wood eventually will decay, go to a landfill, or be burned in someone's, uh, wood stove. So that's a little bit of the total picture. We're going to drill down now. You want to go to the next slide, Joel? Into what these pools are, because this is what people are actually monitoring and inventorying when they talk about carbon storage. So the carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere and fixed into various pools. Let me see if I can move this. Yeah. And so we often talk about a couple of major pools here, which is living biomass. And you can have sub pools. You can talk about an overstory, just the large trees, their various components, the trunk, the branches, the bark, understory trees. And then another big is the below ground biomass, the roots, something we have definitely, forest scientists have definitely quantified, but not something that's easy to quantify on a regular basis, is how much root mass is under your feet. A lot of this stuff has been studied in kind of destructive sampling where they dig out every root in an acre and measure it, and they understand the quantities that are involved. But on a day-to-day, we aren't able to measure every root below the surface. So we take some of the work previous people have done to get some of these estimates. So you can see that up to 50% of the carbon in a forest is contained in organic carbon in the soil. It's a really large pool. Depending on kind of what inventory you're doing, you likely may not include that. That's also very difficult to monitor and measure. All soil carbon, organic soil carbon, is just coming from organic matter that's decomposing and mixing into the soil through microbial action and otherwise. And it's a pool itself. So all these pools, we talk about pools because like carbon's just moving around, fluxing through the environment, and it resides for long or short periods of time in these different pools. And so if you're trying to take a snapshot of the carbon in your forest, monitor it, then you have to get a sense of which pools you're going to measure and which pools you're going to ignore, or which pools you're just going to kind of use an approximation for. Wow. So, and then the last pool, harvested wood products. I talked about that in the earlier slide, but we can take carbon as wood, as dust, as any kinds of wood products, and it can be stored in a product that might, take 20 years to decay, like dust, or it could be stored in a massive beam that's used 800 years from now in a large building for centuries to come. And so anyway, we have these different pools because when we want to monitor carbon, we have to understand where to look for it. Does anyone have any questions up till now? Well, let's jump ahead then, Joel, to the next slide. So if there's carbon pools, there's also this carbon sequestration. And I think people might be familiar with this by now, but there's fundamentally kind of a difference between carbon storage and carbon sequestration, which is just worth talking about again. Carbon sequestration is just the rate of change in various carbon pools. And it's often used shorthand to describe the rate of the forest sucking in carbon. But carbon storage is where the carbon ends up residing. And since different pools have different decay rates, then you also have net sequestration. So you're pulling in carbon through photosynthesis, and decomposition or combustion is releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So the net sequestration rate is how these two rates balance themselves. Are you in a fast period of growth? Are you different decay rates? So we have a little graphic here, which gives you an example about how the age of your forest leads to different amounts of storage and sequestration. So a young forest, um, not as much carbon stored on the landscape because the trees are smaller, the living biomass is smaller. And sequestration is still kind of slow because the trees are still putting down roots, still gathering the materials they need to make explosive growth, which is coming, which is the middle-aged forest, in which you can see the rate of change in this curve is very steep. It's accelerating, and you get maximum sequestration. This is when trees are growing at their biological potential before canopy closure, before stem exclusion, before competition begins to slow them down. So your maximum rate of growth, but you still only have medium storage because the trees are medium sized. Eventually, we get to a mature forest, which has the highest levels of storage, but the trees on a stand level have slowed down their sequestration of carbon. And I think this is, an interesting thing to think about. Where is your forest in this graph? Do you have a young forest, a middle-aged forest, or a mature forest? And it'll give you some idea for what the difference is between storage and sequestration on your property. Um, it's important to make a distinction though between individual tree sequestration and stand sequestration. Until just a few years ago, like in the last 20 years, but certainly in the last 10, it was somewhat unclear to forest scientists if individual tree growth ever slowed down. Um, it's true that as competition for a given stand increases, all the trees are competing for the same resources, and it causes their growth to slow down. And that's why we see these mature forests. The forest has leveled out at the carrying capacity it can support. Um, it can't support more density of trees. Some of them have died off, and so you have this lower sequestration rate per acre. And really importantly, individual trees continue to put on more carbon in every year of their growth than in the year previous. So individual trees are growing. We just can't support such large trees at such high density. So per acre, the tree stand productivity begins to decrease, and that's why we have this lower sequestration. And you'll still find some foresters old foresters in particular, when I was in school, that this concept is new in the literature, and is worth kind of dwelling on. But managing stand density, managing mortality, these are things you can use to still make the most of your growing trees, but kind of managing that growing space potential if you're interested in kind of maximizing photosynthesis and maximizing growth and therefore carbon. Equally really interesting is thinking about decomposition rates, which vary by species. Different species of trees have different wood qualities that allow them to decay at different rates. And the diameter of the tree, a larger log takes like an old growth log might take hundreds of years to decay versus a twig might take a year. And so the diameter of the log or the piece of material really changes how fast that carbon re-enters the atmosphere, right?
Matthew, I've often heard the rule of thumb that a tree, takes about as long to decompose as it was alive. You agree with that? Have you heard that too?
Yeah, I haven't heard that, but that sure makes sense. Because I was thinking like an old growth tree could easily have a log on the landscape for 200, 400, like 200 years. I wouldn't be surprised, especially like a cedar log could be there for 200 years. So, um, yeah, but yeah, and so just yeah, like it's interesting to see. Like when you walk through the woods, you can see this. You'll look at old growth stumps, and you'll notice that the difference in preservation between Douglas fir stump and a Western red cedar stump. The Western red cedar stump will look very preserved, like it was only cut 20 years ago, even though it was cut 120 years ago. And the Douglas fir stump will just be a red pile of decaying wood, So So those two species are leading to very different carbon sequestration, net sequestration rates. So anyway, so species mix matters, the age of your forest matters, and these are all things we can think about when we're trying to understand our carbon accounting in our forest. Um, but I saw we had a couple questions. Maybe we should get through those. Chris asked, the images in the graphics are all evergreens. Is that because deciduous trees don't measure as well as evergreens? Um, this graphic is just from Oregon State University, and I believe they just used evergreens. And I do not know for sure if that is true. I know I don't know if we can say that on for all evergreens and all conifers, but some of the largest carbon trees are like our largest ever, like our large conifers. Well, I'll have a graph in a little bit that shows you the difference between red alder and Douglas fir, kind of different carbon potential those two trees can accumulate in their lifespan. Um,
Yeah, I think the age might change if you were, let's say, if it was a pure alder forest, because those trees are going to start dying, at 70
yeah, like
years. So the
yeah,
mature forest might be, 60 to 100-year range instead of 100 to 500, where
exactly,
it's
yeah,
going to start emitting, you know, almost as much as it's sequestering. But I think the same pattern would still hold. It just depends on the lifespan of the
totally, yes,
dominant
yeah.
species.
The pattern is always this case, this like S-shaped curve is true for all species. But like a shorter tree, like a red alder or big leaf maple, will never get as tall as a Douglas fir, and so they're just going to have possibly less total carbon because they have different heights, different crown widths, different amounts of branches and bark and foliage. Mm. So I don't know if that gives you an answer there, Chris. Carol asked, how do diseased trees, in our case, laminated root rot, store carbon relative to their healthy counterparts? Um, Great question. I fundamentally they their physiology, their processes that give them life are still the same, even if they're diseased. So they still store carbon in their roots, in their trunk, in their leaves. Um, but like laminate rot will cause quite a bit of roots to die, right? And so the tree will be living, but with a much smaller root mass, and that root mass will be decaying as the fungus consumes it. And in consuming it, the fungus will be transferring that uh, fixed carbon as wood into carbon that eventually gets back into the atmosphere through the soil, like loose carbon. It's freeing it from its fixation. Like the tree fixed it and the fungus releases it. And this is like the fundamental battle in the forest between, I would say, between trees and fungi is going on constantly. Trees photosynthesize or various plants, I should say plants photosynthesize, and then their degradation occurs because of wood consuming funguses almost entirely, or fire. I forgot about fire, but yeah, and so the carbon comes down and then it gets released. But I don't know if I have much more to add on that. What about you, Jaal? You want to take the next one?
Um, I think the only other thing that I was going to think about mentioning here, I think we're talking about the mature forests and reducing sequestration rates. I think the main reason it's slowing, why you're not storing very much, is that there's a lot being emitted also, right? Because like you mentioned, that decomposition. So your point is really interesting that at the individual tree level, there's still a lot of carbon being stored. So if
Yeah,
someone has, a 200-year-old tree in their backyard, that tree might still be taking in a ton of carbon, more than it ever has. But overall, on a landscape scale, there's a lot of trees at that point that have died of things like root rot, and
yeah.
they're slowly decaying.
That is actually like the one of the deep truths of carbon accounting in the forest. That we have to remember. We're operating on like a per acre basis or on our backyard basis. On an individual level, yeah, if a tree is growing, it's continuing to be carbon positive, and if a tree is decaying, it's carbon negative. We had a question here about net sequestration or gross. Um, good question on this graphic. Um, this is going to be net sequestration per acre. And is the decay from slash files from a previous logging operation included? No, this is just going to be assuming kind of an abstract bare earth start. We're going to show some graphics that talk about that accumulated carbon through cycles of forest management. But this is just to give you a simplified understanding of what trees are doing left to their own devices. So let's jump to the next slide then. Jaal, if you don't mind. Yeah, okay, so this was just a real quick example. Here is some data taken from the US Forest Service, showing you carbon storage by various pools for two different species, Douglas fir, and this is actually for a combined group called hardwoods. Big leaf maple and red alder had similar rates and were lumped together. But you can see in this Forest Service analysis how they've allocated live trees, snags, so like standing deadwood, downed deadwood, understory vegetation, forest floor, like the litter, needles, decaying foliage, small twigs, and then furthermore, that material decays into soil organic carbon. And then you can see it adds up to the total. So you can just see how this increases over time and how the various pools are working together. Um, and so like and this is just for like kind of average productivity. So really, depending on how productive your site is, how fast your trees grow, you can get much better results or much worse results. This is just for like an average Doug fir stand across the Northwest. We could expect to see living trees in 100 years to have 115 tons of carbon per acre stored in them. And this would be storage, which is the result of net sequestration over time. Yeah, so I just want to show you that. Let's see. Let's take a moment here and make sure if there's any other questions about how we think about pools of carbon, rates of change between the pools. And if we have this kind of framework locked into our head, then we can start talking about some kind of forest management interventions and accounting standards around this paradigm. I don't know if I have the chat up.
Looks like no new questions.
Okay.
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide, please. So here's an example. Basically, carbon accounting is tricky. Prone to lots of, what do you want to call it, skullduggery. I'm sure you all read about various carbon accounting schemes and are the forests providing that carbon. And so it is really tricky. And it ultimately just requires us to agree on a shared accounting framework. So, fundamentally, these carbon stores are always in flux. Naturally, they're always in flux. And when we take any management, we're going to be changing their stores. And so when we're trying to do some kind of accounting scheme, some understanding of what our activity gained us, we need to understand what our baseline is. And there's a lot to say here. We're not going to really get into this today, but this is just to lay out a few factors to take in mind. We're really going to focus on how you understand carbon on your property, but in carbon accounting, there's a lot of like tricky little corners to run down. Are you planting a new forest, afforestation, or are you just reforesting an old forest that you cut down? If you're reforesting, then you think about the carbon debt that you incurred by cutting down the trees. If you're afforesting, then is it really terra nouveau? Do you really get an opportunity just to get all the carbon potential of growing trees? At some point, possibly that forest was cut down. And so where do we put our temporal timelines? How do we draw boundaries around this accounting problem? Balancing the decay rates in forests versus the decay rates in wood products. This really comes down to, this is the ability of human management to potentially change carbon sequestration. If we can move dead wood from the forest into dead wood in a wood product, it has a slightly slower decay rate, then over time we will increase the total carbon in that forest pool. And so it really matters where you're working. Like if you're trying to cut trees out of the far north where natural fungal pathogens work really slowly, like in the taiga and the tundra, it's really unlikely you'll ever produce a wood product that can decay at a slower rate than the natural decay rate of the cold northern forest. Our local temperate forests, yes, you can in many cases, depending on the size of the timber you produce a wood product that is a kind of positive for timber, but not always. Depends on what product you make. Different products have different decay rates, and so much of the tree, doesn't leave the woods, right? Not all of it can become a 2x4. All the branches, all the bark, and so this is where the devil is in the details, balancing these decay rates to understand if your forest, has the potential to be like a net positive sequester through your management activities. Can you, to say it, can you be a climate hero? Can you produce carbon? Can you produce carbon offsets for the world? And there's a bunch of other factors that are really important for carbon accounting on kind of larger spatial scales. We really want carbon accounting to have additionality. This is probably something you guys have heard in the news of people getting paid for carbon credits for no action they took. Was it just kind of a scam? But we really want, if you were truly going to change your managed activity in order to produce more carbon, then maybe someone would be interested in paying you to take that activity. And that's fundamentally the idea of a voluntary carbon credit. But if it's not truly additional, then it's probably not a very good carbon credit that probably shouldn't be sold because it just allows other people to emit carbon and we're double counting. Market leakage is a really important thing to consider. If you're restricting the production of wood on your forest and someone else next door, therefore increases the production of wood on their forest, has anything really changed? If we draw a spatial scale around both your properties, the net carbon from those two properties balance out, right? And so this is just really tricky stuff. How do you decide where the edges are to these effectively accounting problems? And we won't, that's all I'll say about them, but there are, these agreed upon standards, or there are multiple competing agreed upon standards. Some, used by large government organizations like the IPCC to do carbon accounting, others for the issuing of voluntary carbon credits. But I'll just say anyone thinks that carbon is simple. This is where it gets very tricky, and this is where the euphemism I've heard a lot is the carbon cowboys ride in and make a buck understanding one of these aspects just a little bit better than someone else. I'll famously well, I won't get into it. Let's move on. But yeah, just kind of setting up, and so this little pick from the Forest Service, USDA, it's interesting to see like their perspective here. If we look just at one stand, carbon likely goes down, right? If harvesting causes a net increase in emissions or a net decrease in storage because of that graph I showed you where you have a lot of lost productivity during the early years of a stand when it's not growing at its fullest potential. But if we take a broader view and we think about these other pools, such as wood products, such as substitution, and then we begin to have like multi-periodic, like across multiple timber harvests, you can put more carbon into wood products and or into other pools, and you can get a net increase in CO2 storage. And it doesn't have to be wood products, right? Like you could imagine a conservation first approach to carbon storage, where you want to go out and capture as much of, you want to change the rate of decay from small diameter wood to large diameter wood. So you might choose to girdle and restrict the growth of some of your larger trees, knowing that their decay rates will be quite a bit slower than if the smaller trees had died. Right. And so you can play with these levers in your own forest to change their carbon potential. And it doesn't have to be just in harvested wood products. But anyway, that's kind of an overview of how it all stacks out. And with this framework, we can talk about like what type of management activities would we be interested in taking and what kind of impacts they have on carbon. And that's something Jaal has spent some time researching. So I'll turn it over to him to explain those.
Yeah, real quick, there's one question in the chat of what is substitution and what is the impact?
Yeah.
You want to touch on that real quick?
Absolutely. Substitution is basically product substitution. So if by producing a 2x4, you decrease the amount of steel being used in buildings, right? So moving away from a carbon intensive product to a substituted low carbon product like timber. And whether you include that benefit or not depends on your agreed upon accounting framework. That's kind of just a cultural proposition. You can decide where to draw your lines. But that is one of the ideas around moving towards this timber frame construction or creating larger buildings out of wood is the ability that we can produce wood. It's a renewable resource in our lifetime. Whereas steel, concrete, they have higher per unit carbon costs, and they are renewable. So that's the idea of substitution. There's also energy substitution, which is probably more controversial and involves the idea that you could burn wood in some kind of cogeneration facility to offset, the burning of oil and coal in a power plant. And so that's another idea of substitution.
Yeah, and one other thought on this figure that we're looking at here is, at least in our region, that the dotted line for without timber harvest doesn't seem quite right. I mean, they're showing a dramatic decrease in sequestration starting at less than 40 years old, which in our region, trees are really just getting going. So the reality, that line, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but it would kind of keep going up quite a bit longer and start leveling off, maybe all the way past the 100 years.
Right.
So it's something to keep in mind. And
we'll look at that. That's shaped, right? Do you agree?
Yeah, no, it'll slow down because on the landscape scale, and we'll actually look at that on our next slide here a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some modeling that we've done at NNRG of carbon, and then also get into how you can pretty easily get some rough measurements of carbon in your own forest. So here's one modeling exercise that we did a couple years ago, which was looking at how much more carbon does a forest sequester when its management shifts from business as usual 40-year rotations to longer 80-year rotations. So this is still assuming a clear cut at 80, though there are other options at that point. You could continue doing variable density thinning or do a variable retention harvest to keep some of those older trees in the landscape. So like Matthew was saying, because the forest is in its prime and growing rapidly at age 40, you can grow substantially more carbon and timber per acre per year by extending rotations to 80 years. So that's because if you clear cut at age 40, it's going to be many years of essentially no sequestration while the trees are tiny. And during that time, the stand that you're growing out to 80 years, those are, 41, 42-year-old trees, and they're growing really quickly. So in this figure, you can see the total stand carbon over a 100-year period for each management style between those two. And the top section in green is the total stand carbons. That's including the live trees, the harvested products that have gone into the landfill, and the harvested products still in use, as well as things like leaf litter, and I believe this is counting soil carbon as well, though your comments earlier, Matthew, make me not quite sure. Because it doesn't really change as much after harvest as these other factors.
Yeah, this is from FBS, right, Jaal?
Yeah.
Yeah, I confirmed it does not include soil.
Okay. So it's essentially assuming the soil carbon is staying steady throughout this management, which is controversial, right? There's been some research questioning that.
Yeah, so It often stay. It takes a while to change, but
Mhm. Yeah,
changing
long
moisture.
term, it could.
Yeah, if you change the temperature of your soil and the moisture that arrives at your soil, you can change the microbial action of your soil. And so it is likely we'll learn more about how forest soils change under different management regimes.
Mhm. So, yeah, as Matthew mentioned, much of the carbon removed is stored for various lengths of time in various products. So the bottom portion that's in blue is products made from woods. That's houses, paper, everything else made out of wood material. That middle portion in red is products in landfills, which is where most of these products eventually end up. So I think it's really interesting that over time, as these wood products reach the end of their lives, the portion of harvested carbon stored in landfills becomes substantial. So over this 100-year period, the 80-year rotation, which is the one on the left, stored an average of 87 tons per acre. The 40-year only had 57 tons per acre. So about 50% more carbon stored on average across that whole 100-year period just by increasing your rotation length. And you're also producing more lumber per acre per year also. So it's kind of a win-win, unless you're, an accountant at a large timber company saying we need to get our revenue sooner. And in that case, that's why they're often harvesting faster, because they're looking at what else could they do with that money if they were to harvest sooner. So you might be asking, why are we clear cutting 80 years here? At NNRG, we do a lot of thinning of older stands. So we also did have that same question and ran this analysis, including both a no management scenario and a perpetual thinning, kind of continued thinning scenario. So this figure is showing total stand carbon per acre, which is including harvested products and landfill stored carbon. And because it's including that stored carbon, you'll see that the carbon storage over time is increasing with every management scenario. So even the bottom line, which is the 40-year rotations, you can see it's still increasing over time because those harvested products are building up. And so essentially any forest management we're doing in this country anyway is going to store more carbon over time. But you can see the 80-year rotation storing about 50% more carbon than the 40-year. That's the second one from the bottom. And then the second one the no management scenario is the one at the top in purple. And you can see the rapid initial growth. And that's because there's so many trees per acre, the site's fully occupied really quickly. But then towards the end of the scenario, you do see that the growth is starting to slow down. That's that S-shaped curve. In this model, it's happening a little bit later. There's lots of parameters on models that can be tweaked. The models aren't quite as good when you're modeling an older stand like this. So it might level out a little bit sooner than this in reality. But it's interesting to see that the perpetual thinning model is growing more rapidly at some point here. So it is starting to converge. And we think it's likely if eventually the thin only model would store more carbon than the no management model, as more of those trees in the no management model are starting to die. It's also important to note that actually we'll go to the next slide here. So yeah, it's important to note that the no management scenario is going to have large numbers of small trees, little to no understory, because little light's making it through the canopy. So you're going to have lower quality wildlife habitat, and extreme competition between the trees is going to increase their susceptibility to drought, insects, wildfire. So because of that, we still recommend thinning in most cases for the many other benefits that landowners going to get, even if in some scenarios you could store more carbon by doing nothing. So in the no management scenario, the forest is going to look more like this example on the left for a lot longer, where you've got just a lot of trees, no understory, and it's going to take a lot more time to reach the mature state that you're seeing in the photo on the right. So I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit here now to show you this carbon estimator we've got now. And it's a kind of simplified way that you can calculate how much carbon, timber volume are present in your forest and determine if a thinning is likely to be commercially viable, meaning is it going to at least break even when all of your costs are considered. So exit out of this and exit out of that, switch there. Cool. Are you all still seeing this okay? Cool. So this is the estimator. So we're often asked at NNRG by landowners how they can get a rough idea of how much carbon and timber is in their forest. And we have kind of a carbon calculator, woody biomass calculator we've shared in the past, which is a really useful tool, but this learning curve is kind of steep with it. So I thought it would be useful to make this really simplified version where you don't actually even have to measure tree height. So really all you're measuring is the number of trees in a 20th acre plot and their diameter. So you're sacrificing some precision there because we're kind of generalizing heights, but it can give you a ballpark estimate that can be really useful for figuring out whether you have enough timber volume to do a commercial thinning, or if you just roughly want an idea how much carbon you have in your forest. And this is sort of similar to the process that we're going through when we go out on a site visit and we're just kind of looking around, counting some rough numbers, getting a rough idea in our heads of whether a harvest is going to be feasible. So I'm just going to walk you through this spreadsheet real quickly and how you could use it on your own, and we can send this out afterwards as a resource for anyone who wants to try it out. Bear in mind that it is a beta tester form, so if you do try it out and run into any errors or have any feedback, I'd be happy to hear that so we can improve this before we share it more widely. So it's got here's the basic stand inventory steps. It can handle between 1 and 6 plots. Usually you want to pick those randomly, or if you're just doing, a couple plots, you could pick areas that you think are representative of the stand. So in a full cruise, we've set our plots randomly or systematically throughout the stand. In this case, for kind of an informal estimate, you can have a little more bias to make sure that you're measuring in an area that is representative of what you're trying to capture. So you'd measure a 26.3 foot radius, which is a 20th acre plot. You're going to count the number of live trees over 5-inch diameter and within the plot and record their diameters. And while you're measuring the plot, there's a few things to make notes of. The main species of tree being removed, if there are any steep slopes over about 40%, because anything steeper than that, you're probably going to need cable logging, which is more expensive and will affect the feasibility. And if there are any streams over 2 feet wide, which might be fish bearing, or which would have to be crossed, especially which would have to be crossed for logging access, because crossing those can be very expensive. So the green cells here are where you're going to enter data, then the gray cells are automatically calculated. So just as an example here, let's say we've got a 20-acre stand, and my first plot I got 8-inch tree, 9-inch tree, 11-inch, 12-inch, a few smaller trees, and maybe one big tree. And so I just did one plot in this stand, and it's saying I've got a little under 10-inch average diameter in the stand and a little under 7-inch diameter of the smaller half. Now, the reason it's giving this is that when we do a first entry thinning in a young stand, which is what the majority of thinnings in this area end up being, we're taking about half of the trees and we're thinning from below, so we're taking the smaller half of the trees. So what this is telling us is we have 160 trees per acre. The average trees we would be removing if we were to thin here would be about 7 inches. And then over here on the right, it's giving us some results here, because we just have one plot. We're averaging 160 trees per acre. These are the same. And the total stand board feet is 88,000 board feet. The total board feet that we've removed, which is the volume of those smaller half of the trees, it's saying not commercial size because those are under 7 inches, meaning that they're likely going to be pulp logs, which with current markets are not going to be viable. So let's just go in here and make these a little bit bigger. Now our average diameter of the trees to be removed is 8.3 inches. We've got 138,000 total stand board feet. That's over those 20 acres. We're going to remove 19 board feet. So we're still removing, because there's a pretty big spread in the size of the trees we're removing are really not that much volume. And then here it's just from that volume, it's calculating your metric tons of carbon, and this is in live standing trees. So this is not accounting for total stand carbon. And yeah, I think it's you can there's some conversion factors you could use to estimate total stand carbon, but this is essentially live tree carbon. It's also giving you carbon dioxide equivalent, which is useful because often carbon calculators will report in CO2 equivalent, and all that is you multiply carbon by 3.67, and that gives you carbon dioxide equivalent. So just something to keep in mind if you use a carbon footprint calculator and it gives you carbon dioxide equivalent, this would let you compare that. And then here in the remove, that's looking at if in your thinning, you're going to remove 35 metric tons of carbon of the 251 that are currently in the stand. And so this piece down here is about commercial thinning viability. So let's say our main species we're moving is Doug fir. And let's say we don't have to do any new road construction on slopes and we're not crossing any 2-foot wide streams. Let's say there aren't any significant slopes over 40%. It's going to tell me it's still probably not a viable commercial thinning. And that's because 19,000 board feet, that's just about 4 log trucks. It's just not enough volume to be worthwhile. But let's say we change, our stand is actually 40 acres. That's still not quite enough. Let's say our stand is 40 acres and we've got slightly larger trees. Now our average diameter we're moving is almost 10 inches. We're moving about 100,000 board feet, and it's probably a viable commercial thinning. So the other thing this viability tool can do is if you have steep slopes, for example, let's say your slope's over 40% and you have to use cable logging, that's probably not going to be viable. Let's say our stand is 100 acres. That's still not quite enough. You'll need a lot of volume to make a cable thinning feasible, is what you can see here. So 150 acres with this amount of volume, that might be a viable commercial thinning, even with the steep slopes, just because the costs for cable thinning are so much higher. And then again, here, if you have road construction on slopes or crossing potential fish-bearing streams, you're going to need more evaluation of your access feasibility, because those costs can just be so highly variable. That's where you might have a forester like one of us, or someone from DNR come out and take a look and see what they think. And not sure, it'll be contingent on access. So it'd be something you'd still have to figure out later. So yeah, and you can fill out up to 6 plots here, and just starting at number 1 and going through, and it'll basically average the plots as you start filling them out. So now this is averaging those 2 plots, got 10.2 inch diameter average. I'm going to remove 420,000 board feet, which makes sense because my stand is 150 acres now. So that's a pretty big stand. Some things to keep in mind here, since we're not measuring heights, it's essentially assuming your heights are 80 times your diameter, which is a useful metric because in a stand that's dense and needs thinning, one of the indicators of that is that your heights exceed 80 times your diameter, meaning those trees have really been competing for a long time, growing tall and sacrificing diameter growth to try and outgrow their neighbors. So in a stand that needs thinning, usually your height is going to be higher than that. So this will give you a somewhat conservative estimate, which is the goal. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got there about this. And yeah, we'll send it out afterwards as an email. I can get that to Laura. And we hope that some of you might play with this, put in some plots in your forest. We're going to be putting together some more kind of explainers and I think a little video about this also in the near future. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, hopefully it'll be a useful tool for you to get rough ideas of whether your thinning is going to be viable and how much carbon you're storing in your woods. And when you're done here, we've got this handy clear button, and that'll clear it all out for you. And you can start again. All right. So I think ready for any other questions you might have. We can look at the chat, see if there's anything already.
There's a couple in here. I'll just start by reading a comment that goes back to the soil conversation. Much of the soil carbon is stored in the upper soil and in the O horizon. So preventing erosion and preventing loss of the O horizon is an important way to retain soil carbon. Thanks for sharing that. All right. And Jaal, this I can't remember which slide this was on. Presuming the total C is the area of the green, do you have a number to compare the areas of red alder? Oops, I'm just blocking my screen, sorry. Sorry, the areas of red and blue too. I'm trying to remember which slide you were on when that came in.
Yeah, let me see if I can
it was the one
go back
before
to that.
Yeah, I think it was the one right before this.
No, I think you're talking about this one, right?
Yep.
Okay. So you're saying numbers comparing the harvested or the landfill and products between the two. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. No. Yeah, I think the board feet of timber that we're showing here would be a good approximation for that, because that's pretty much all going to go into products, obviously with some loss. But if we're comparing between the two, I think that would be a good way to look at it. You've got 82,000 board feet produced in that 80-year rotation over the 100-year period, and 54,000 board feet produced over that same period using 40-year rotations. So it's a pretty similar number to the carbon, actually, interestingly.
That's helpful. Thank you.
All right, next question. Richard is trying to figure out how to measure carbon in a 20-acre plot. Do I measure some small areas, 26.3 feet by 26.3 feet, or something else? Seems challenging. So some advice there.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The 26.3 is the radius of a 20th acre plot. So you can do the math on that if you want to double check it, but it's essentially you establish a plot location, find a spot that you think is representative, or randomize it if you're going to do enough of them, and you're standing in that plot center, and from there you can basically spin around and measure which trees are within 26.3 feet of your location. So you can do that, with a measuring tape. We use, lasers, or get those construction style lasers that, shine a red dot, are really great, and you can get them for, $20 to $80. They're really not very expensive. So getting yourself one of those would be super useful. And you basically just spin around, count all the trees, and measure diameter for everything that's within 26.3 feet of where you're standing. And if you put in a few plots in areas that seem representative of the stand, you can get a rough idea. If you want more detailed numbers, you would probably want to do, a more systematic cruise with more plots, and then running that through something like our woody biomass calculator or different cruising software.
All right. Next question. Can you do anything to increase carbon storage in soil in a forest on an acreage scale?
Good question. Yeah. Scott, do you mind telling what you mean? Like mending the soil, or something you do with the trees? Oh, I can't hear you, Scott, if you're adding a thought on that. But
there. Can you hear me now?
okay. Yep, thanks.
Yeah, I'm thinking on adding something like, I don't know, tossing salmon through your woods, dead salmon,
or biochar or something,
or biochar.
Yeah. Well, right. So biochar.
But I get either of those. That's a lot of biochar to toss around. In a single, even just an acre. If you have more than that, that's a lot of tossing.
I don't have a good answer for you. I think it's interesting because most of the time we talk about ways to increase kind of the organic loading of the soil. So bringing more biomass down to the soil microbes. And then they'll chew through that in time. Some of that gets released. Some of it gets stabilized in the soil for centuries. So I usually think of more of like, what can I do to load my soil with organic matter? But I don't know, and it's a very good point. What can you do to change those microbial processes or somehow manipulate the rate of that process? I'm not sure.
I would think that the biggest influence we can have is just to grow big trees and get trees growing as quickly and as possible, as healthy as possible, because that's going to build soil, right, as the material from those trees ends up starting to decay.
Yeah, but also like picking a hardwood over a conifer will move more biomass into the soil. Like your total potential is lower, but like every growing season, those leaves drop. You're going to get more litter drop. So if you do things that increase litter drop, if you brush out your forest and it regrows, or if you favor hardwoods which have a higher litter drop, I think you would have more organic loading. But yeah, it's still about just growing, like fixing more carbon from the air and then putting it down into the soil. But great question, Scott. I don't know. I'll think about that more for sure.
We have
Yeah,
a
Laura.
couple more minutes and a couple more questions here. So, do you guys have any guesstimate on when, if the carbon market will be practical for us smaller guys? We harvest 15 acres every 5 years and have a total of 200.
I'll let you take that one, Matthew.
Yeah. When will it be practical? I'm actually, yeah, still trying to research this question on a personal level. I've been asking for a while that question. At what carbon price, you know, would any landowner be interested in changing their activities? A lot of people are interested in change in producing carbon kind of for their own reasons. And then we might ask if their actions are really additional, right? If you weren't motivated to do something else and you weren't induced to change your activity by the carbon credit, then was your action really producing more carbon for the world? And so, yeah, what is that price at which you really begin to induce activity? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I think a few things have to come into play. The carbon price is really volatile, and it changes a lot. I think we were talking about actually doing like a fireside chat in a month or two about just carbon credits, and maybe I can get a better answer for you then. There's a lot of people that are offering carbon credits, but I just couldn't tell you if any of them are a good deal for a small landowner harvesting 15 acres. But since you have like a baseline activity that includes harvest, that's a really interesting proposition to a carbon accountant, because they might just ask you to harvest 15 acres every 10 years and pay you to delay your harvest by 5 years, or to extend these rotations by a little bit, right? So you'd be a great candidate to potentially benefit, but I don't have a better answer for you right now.
Yeah.
I got
All right.
Your price is high, Carol? Okay, good.
Scroll down. So we'll have a meadow, maybe a couple acres to maximize carbon over the coming decades. How should I look at which species of trees to plant?
I think you would want to think about what's going to thrive on your site, because a healthy, fast-growing tree is going to store more carbon. So, if there are droughty soils, you might look at, Doug fir or pine trees. If it's a more moist area, something like cedar, or also still potentially Doug fir, depending on how wet it is, could do well. I mean, you want something that's long-lived and fast-growing, essentially.
Right, exactly. Yeah, which is our native Doug fir, a real jack of all trades species, which we maybe see too much of, but it truly grows so fast and can live so long. Like alder grows fast, but it's all gone in 80 to 100 years,
Yeah, and some people talk about, planting redwoods and stuff like that in these scenarios, which they do grow incredibly fast and hold a lot of carbon in some scenarios, but it's still kind of an open question of how are they going to handle, climate change, increasing drought, and of course they're not really a native species here. So, how much benefit are they going to have for habitat for microbes and fungi and wildlife? There's kind of a lot of unknowns about using redwoods, on a larger scale.
All right, and our final question of the night: what do people do with this information about carbon sequestration? Why is it needed? This pop-up keeps blocking me. Is it used to generate income by selling it to a business that needs the carbon from your forest? Good way to run.
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a big question to drop
we
right
probably
at
should
the end.
have led with that. Yeah, you don't need to frame it always in a monetary way. If you're interested in this as a management goal, then you want to be able to monitor these pools of carbon so that you can assess if they're meeting your management objectives and maybe change your management, like planting fast-growing trees or changing your harvest cycle to meet that objective of yours. If you want to make money, then yes, it's also useful to generate income by selling your carbon to someone who needs your carbon. I think those are the two main reasons you would do it, for management objectives and for a potential income source. And it's just a really close proxy, like Jaal showed, to to growth. And so sometimes just while you're assessing your forest growth, it's very easy, if you're already going to be doing that work, just to add on the dimension of carbon. And so you can see how that's working too.
Right, and I didn't mention in that estimator I've shared, it's getting carbon essentially. It's just a math problem from the tree. Essentially, half of a tree's dry weight is carbon, and a tree's dry weight is half of its green weight. So we can convert from board feet to tons using some conversion factors, and then just divide that by 4 essentially, and you've got carbon. So it's really a pretty simple math formula to figure out roughly carbon from log volume. The one thing I'd also add on why you care about this. I mean, I think you mentioned man objective, Matthew, and I think that would just be, I think some people own timberland, for environmental reasons, and they want to offset their carbon footprint maybe as part of their plan, and that's why it would be in there. So for me, at least, that's what I would find interesting about this is, you could see, all right, here's my carbon footprint, how much my travel and everything emitted this year, and here's how much is in my forest. And, then you could also project forward how much is it sequestering each year. And that's something we actually could potentially help with is under some of our new grant funding that we just rolled out last week, doing some modeling. So talk to us if you're interested in finding out that sort of stuff.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that personal perspective. I hadn't thought many of you might be more carbon neutral in your lifestyles than you imagined because you're forest owners. I wonder if we could quantify that. Like how many lifestyles how many family members can your forest support?
Right. It's kind of it's a fun
footprint up.
It's a fun thing to know, even if it's not that practical to get paid for it yet, unfortunately.
Right. Right.
And one comment to Richard just said in the chat is there was just some analysis of carbon credit options in our most recent newsletter. So you could go back to that and take a look. And it's also something that, like Matthew said, we're planning to probably do a fireside chat on a little bit later on. It's been kind of a challenge to really get that much detail from some of these carbon crediting companies because they're all so variable in their approaches. And, sometimes they don't want to give away all their secrets to anyone who calls them up. So it's something we're still kind of working on, but there was some info on that in our most recent newsletter.
Do we have a sense how many people on the call has this satiated your appetite or just whetted your appetite to learn about carbon? It'd be interesting to know how much you would like to know about this. We can put it on the agenda if so. We should have had a poll or something.
I'm not that fast. You could use the little reactions at the bottom of the screen. If you click reactions, you can put a thumbs. If you want more, I guess those aren't super helpful, but or use the chat. Just give them a feel of where you're at. More info is welcome. Definitely be able to save the chat and pull that into a future one.
Okay, yeah, so like you said, Carol, everyone's kind of waiting for the advances in the market mechanisms and the pricing. Someone mentioned they did a carbon sale with NNRG around 2010. Yeah, NNRG did historically try to get a little more involved with carbon sales, and that was well before I was here, but it didn't go so well, I guess is the short version. So there's definitely some market mechanisms still to work out, and really just need the prices to go up to make it all more worthwhile.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I will have this recording up on our website tomorrow and can send out the carbon calculator that Jaal shared with you as well. So thanks for your time.
All right.
See you next
Thanks,
month.
everyone.
Yeah, real pleasure.